It's February 27th, 1943. The frozen mountains of Norway stand silent under a moonless sky, their jagged peaks swallowed by winter darkness. Somewhere deep in the Telemark region, 9 men are moving through waist-deep snow, their skis cutting whispers into the night. They're exhausted, frostbitten, and carrying enough explosives to either change the course of the war or get themselves killed. The temperature has dropped to -25°C, and every breath burns their lungs like frozen fire. They've been skiing and climbing for hours, navigating terrain that would kill most men even without the weight of what they're about to do. Below them, nestled into the side of a gorge so steep it seems to defy gravity, sits a concrete fortress disguised as a hydroelectric plant. Inside that facility, in steel cylinders cooled by machinery and guarded by German soldiers, is something the Nazis believe will hand them victory. Heavy water. Not ordinary water, but deuterium oxide, a substance so rare and so critical to nuclear fission that whoever controls its production might control the atomic future of mankind. And tonight, these 9 Norwegians commandos, resistance fighters, patriots who left their families and risked everything, are going to destroy it. This is Operation Gunnerside. This is the night that a handful of skiers stopped Hitler's atomic bomb. And this is a story about how sometimes the fate of the entire world comes down to courage, improvisation, and the kind of cold that freezes your eyelashes shut before you can blink twice. To understand why 9 men were willing to die on a Norwegian mountainside in the dead of winter, you have to understand what the world looked like in 1942 and early 1943. And more importantly, you have to understand what terrified the Allied High Command so deeply that they were willing to gamble everything on a mission that seemed borderline suicidal. Let's rewind. In December 1938, German chemists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann succeeded in splitting the uranium atom. Within months, physicists across Europe and America understood the implications. Nuclear fission could release energy on a scale never before imagined. Weaponized, it could level cities. Theoretical papers were published. Calculations were made. And then, as war clouds gathered over Europe, those papers stopped being published. Scientists went quiet. Governments took notice. By 1939, Albert Einstein, who had fled Nazi Germany, was convinced to sign a letter to President Franklin Roosevelt warning that Germany might be developing atomic weapons. The letter was understated, cautious, but its message was clear. If Hitler got the bomb first, the war was over. Not just lost over, the mathematics of uranium were terrifying. A single bomb, if the physics worked, could destroy an entire city in seconds. No army could march against it. No navy could blockade it. No air force could shoot it down. Whoever had it first would dictate the terms of peace, and those terms might include the obliteration of London, Moscow, or New York as a demonstration. So the race was on. The Americans launched what would become the Manhattan Project. The British began their own research under the codename Tube Alloys, and German scientists, working under the patronage of the Third Reich, pushed forward with their own atomic program, led by the brilliant and morally ambiguous Werner Heisenberg. But there was a problem, a big one. To build an atomic bomb using natural uranium, you needed a moderator AA substance that could slow down neutrons without absorbing them, allowing a sustained chain reaction. The Americans chose graphite. The Germans, for reasons both scientific and strategic, chose heavy water, and there was only one place in the world producing heavy water in meaningful quantities. The Vemork plant, perched on the edge of a cliff in the Telemark region of Nazi-occupied Norway. Vemork was a marvel of engineering even before the war. Built into the side of a gorge, it used the immense hydroelectric power of the Rjukan waterfall to produce fertilizer, and as a byproduct, heavy water. Before 1940, the plant made about 12 litres per day, a curiosity for scientists, nothing more. But after the German invasion of Norway in April 1940, production ramped up dramatically. The Nazis knew what they had. By 1942, Vemork was producing over 120 kilograms of heavy water per month, and every drop was being shipped to Germany for Heisenberg's reactor experiments. British intelligence got wind of this through a network of Norwegian resistance operatives and scientists who had fled to London. When Winston Churchill's scientific advisors reviewed the reports, the conclusion was unanimous. Vemork had to be destroyed. Not damaged, not delayed, destroyed completely, permanently, no matter the cost. But how do you destroy a heavily guarded industrial facility built into the side of a mountain in occupied Norway, hundreds of miles from any Allied base, surrounded by terrain so hostile that even locals called it unforgiving. The British Special Operations Executive, the SOE, began planning, and what they came up with was bold, desperate, and as it would turn out, almost impossible. The first attempt to sabotage Vemork was called Operation Freshman, and it was a catastrophe. In November 1942, 2 British gliders carrying 34 Royal Engineers were towed by Halifax bombers toward Norway. The plan was to land near Vemork, assault the plant, and blow it up. But the weather turned violent. One glider crashed into a mountain, killing everyone aboard. The other crash-landed miles off target. The survivors were captured by the Gestapo, interrogated, tortured, and executed under Hitler's infamous commando order, which decreed that all captured commandos were to be killed. No exceptions, no trials. The mission failed before it began, and 34 men died without firing a shot. The Allies were devastated, but they didn't give up. If a large-scale assault wouldn't work, maybe something smaller would, something smarter, something Norwegian. Enter the Company Linge, a unit of Norwegian commandos trained by the British SOE in Scotland. These men were not just soldiers, they were skiers, mountaineers, hunters, and outdoorsmen who knew the Norwegian wilderness the way a sailor knows the sea. They could survive in conditions that would kill trained British or American troops in hours. They knew how to navigate by starlight, how to read snow, how to move silently through forests in the dead of winter, and most importantly, they were fighting for their homeland. The plan for Operation Gunnerside was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its execution. A small team of Norwegian commandos would parachute into the mountains near Vemork, link up with an advance reconnaissance team already on the ground codenamed Grouse, which had been surviving in the mountains since October, and together they would infiltrate the plant, destroy the heavy water production cells, and escape on skis across the Hardangervidda Plateau, one of the most desolate stretches of wilderness in Europe. No backup, no air support, no rescue if things went wrong. The Gunnerside team consisted of 6 men, led by 23-year-old Lieutenant Joachim Rønneberg, a quiet, methodical soldier with a reputation for calmness under pressure. With him were Knut Haukelid, a tough, wiry man with a dark sense of humor; Kasper Eidland, an engineer who understood explosives; Frederick Kaiser, a crack shot and demolitions expert; Hans Storhaug, strong and dependable; and Birger Stromsheim, the team's radio operator and morale anchor. They trained for weeks in the Scottish Highlands, practicing skiing in blizzards, handling explosives with frozen fingers, memorizing blueprints of the Vemork plant, and rehearsing every step of the mission until it became muscle memory. They knew the margins were razor thin, one mistake a guard spotting them, an explosive charge failing, a wrong turn in the dark and they'd be dead or worse, captured and tortured like the men of Operation Freshman. On the night of February 16th, 1943, they boarded a Halifax bomber at RAF Tempsford in England. The plane roared into the winter sky, engines straining, carrying the 6 men and their equipment toward Norway. The flight was brutal. Turbulence hammered the plane. Ice formed on the wings. The crew navigated by dead reckoning through clouds and darkness, searching for a frozen lake where the grouse team was supposed to light signal fires. Somehow, against all odds, they found it. The drop zone appeared below a white expanse of snow bordered by black forest. The dispatcher yelled, "Go!" And one by one, the men jumped into the howling void, parachutes snapping open in the frozen air, containers of weapons and explosives tumbling after them. They landed scattered across miles of wilderness. It took them 2 days to regroup, find their equipment, and make contact with the grouse team, who had been living in a tiny mountain cabin for 4 months, surviving on moss, reindeer meat, and sheer stubbornness. When the 2 groups finally met, there was no celebration, just grim nods and a shared understanding. They were about to attempt something that had never been done before. For 10 days, the combined grouse and gunnerside team, now 9 men in total, watched Vemork from the mountains above. They studied the guards' routines, counted the patrols, noted when the lights went on and off, memorized every road and path leading to the plant. They learned that the facility was surrounded by minefields, barbed wire, searchlights, and heavily armed German soldiers. A frontal assault would be suicide. But Rønneberg noticed something. The plant was built into the side of a gorge so steep and treacherous that the Germans assumed no one would be crazy enough to attack from that direction. There were no mines on the cliff face. No searchlights pointed downward. The defences all faced outward, toward the roads and bridges, What if, Rønneberg thought, we don't come from the outside? What if we come from below? It was insane. The gorge dropped 600 feet almost vertically, covered in ice and snow. Climbing down in daylight would be nearly impossible. Doing it at night, in winter, while carrying explosives and weapons, was madness. But it was also the only way. On the night of February 27th, under a sky heavy with clouds that blocked even starlight, the 9 men began their descent. They moved in single file, roped together, testing every foothold, every handhold, knowing that a single slip could send them all tumbling into the frozen river far below. The wind roared through the gorge, a constant howl that swallowed every sound they made. Snow stung their faces. Their fingers, even through gloves, went numb within minutes. They couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. They navigated by feel, by instinct, by faith. Hours passed. What should have taken 30 minutes took 3 hours. But finally, impossibly, they reached the bottom of the gorge. They crouched in the snow beside the frozen river, catching their breath, listening. Above them, the Vemork plant loomed like a concrete fortress, lights glowing in a few windows, steam rising from vents. They could hear the hum of machinery, the faint sound of voices, German voices. They were inside the defensive perimeter now, past the mines and the wire, but they still had to climb the opposite side of the gorge, cross a railway track, and somehow break into the plant without alerting the guards. Rønneberg made a decision. They would split into 2 groups. He would lead the sabotage team himself, Kaiser, Idland, and Stromsheim, directly to the plant. Haukelid and the others would provide cover and be ready to fight if the alarm was raised. The plan was simple. Get in, blow the heavy water production cells, and get out. No fighting unless absolutely necessary. Speed and silence were everything. They climbed the second cliff face, slower now, more careful, knowing they were exposed. If a guard looked down at the wrong moment, if a searchlight swept across the gorge, they'd be spotted. But luck held. Or maybe it was skill. Or maybe it was the sheer audacity of the plan. The Germans simply couldn't imagine anyone would attack from this direction. At the top, they crouched behind a storage shed listening. The plant was quiet. A single guard walked past, his boots crunching on gravel, his breath visible in the cold. He didn't look down. He didn't see the shadows pressed against the wall. When he passed, the sabotage team moved. Rønneberg had memorized the blueprints, but seeing the plant in person was different. The building was larger, more labyrinthine. They found a door locked, but not alarmed. Idland picked it in seconds. They slipped inside. The interior was dimly lit. The hum of machinery louder now, echoing through concrete corridors. Somewhere above them, German soldiers were drinking coffee, playing cards, completely unaware. The sabotage team moved through the basement like ghosts, navigating by memory and intuition. They found the heavy water production room, a long chamber filled with steel cylinders, pipes, gauges, and the faint chemical smell of deuterium oxide. This was it. The target. The reason they'd come. Kaiser and Idland went to work immediately, placing explosive charges on the cylinders with the practiced efficiency of men who'd rehearsed this 100 times. They used Nobel 808 plastic explosive, shaped to direct the blast inward, to rupture the containers and drain the heavy water without causing a massive explosion that would bring the entire German garrison down on them. They set the fuses for 30 seconds. That was barely enough time to get out, but any longer risked someone discovering them before the charges blew. Rønneberg did a final check. The charges were set. The fuses were ready. He looked at his men, saw the tension in their faces, the focus, the fear held tightly in check. He nodded. Kaiser lit the fuses. The hiss of the burning cord was the only sound. And then they ran. 30 seconds. It doesn't sound like much, but when you're sprinting through a dark basement in enemy territory with explosives about to detonate behind you, 30 seconds stretches into a strange kind of eternity. Rønneberg and his team burst out of the plant and threw themselves into the snow just as the charges detonated. The explosion was sharp, contained a muffled crump rather than a roar. It wasn't designed to destroy the building, just the heavy water cells. But inside the plant, it was devastation. The steel cylinders ruptured. More than 500 kilograms of heavy water months of production, the lifeblood of Germany's atomic program, poured onto the floor, seeped into drains, evaporated into air. Gone. Irreplaceable. For a moment there was silence. Then alarms began to scream. Searchlights blazed to life. Voices shouted in German. The garrison was waking up, scrambling, confused. Where had the explosion come from? Inside the plant? Outside? A bombing raid? Sabotage? The 9 Norwegians didn't wait to find out. They sprinted toward the gorge, sliding and stumbling down the icy slope they'd climbed just hours earlier. Behind them, German soldiers flooded out of barracks, rifles ready, scanning the darkness. Shots rang out wild, directionless. The Germans were shooting at shadows, at ghosts. The Norwegians reached the bottom of the gorge, crossed the frozen river, and began the brutal climb up the opposite cliff. Behind them, the plant burned with light and chaos, but the darkness and the terrain swallowed them. By dawn, they were miles away, skiing hard across the Hardangervidda plateau, putting distance between themselves and Vemork. The Germans searched for days. They brought in dogs, trackers, additional troops. They interrogated locals, imposed curfews, arrested suspected resistance members. They found nothing. The 9 men had vanished into the wilderness like smoke. The escape was its own kind of hell. The team split up to avoid detection, traveling in pairs or alone across 250 miles of frozen tundra, dodging patrols, navigating by compass and stars, surviving on whatever food they'd carried and whatever they could scavenge. Some skied to Sweden, crossing the border into neutral territory. Others made their way to Oslo and went underground, rejoining the resistance. Rønneberg himself skied for days through conditions that would kill most men, finally reaching Sweden exhausted, frostbitten, but alive. Not a single man was captured. Not one was killed. It was a miracle of planning skill and sheer endurance. But the real question remained. Had it worked? Had they actually stopped the German atomic program, or had they just delayed it? The answer came slowly, pieced together through intelligence reports, intercepted communications, and post-war interrogations. The sabotage of Vemork didn't just damage the German heavy water supply, it shattered it. Production at the plant was halted for months. When the Germans finally resumed production, the Allies bombed Vemork from the air in a massive raid that destroyed much of the facility. The Germans tried to salvage what heavy water remained and transport it to Germany by ferry across Lake Tinn. In a final desperate act of sabotage, Knut Haukelid I of the original Gunnerside commandos managed to plant explosives on the ferry. On February 20th, 1944, the ferry sank, taking the last of Germany's heavy water to the bottom of the lake. After the war, Allied investigators combed through German atomic research files. What they found was sobering. Werner Heisenberg and his team had been years away from a working bomb, hampered by miscalculations, lack of resources, and critically lack of heavy water. The German atomic program never posed a real threat, but the Allies didn't know that in 1943. They couldn't know. So they acted, and in acting, they ensured that whatever slim chance Hitler had of developing nuclear weapons was extinguished. There's a tendency, decades after great events, to smooth them into legends, to strip away the fear and the doubt and the cold and the confusion, and reduce them to clean narratives about heroes and villains, good and evil. Operation Gunnerside resists that simplification because the men who carried it out were so profoundly human. They weren't superhuman, they were cold. They were scared. They missed their families. They argued about the best route to take. They got lost. They got frostbite. They questioned whether they'd survive. But they kept moving. They kept planning. They kept executing. And in the end, they succeeded where a much larger, better equipped British force had failed catastrophically. Why? What made the difference? Part of it was local knowledge. The Norwegians knew the terrain, the weather, the culture. They could blend in when needed, disappear when necessary. They understood how to survive in conditions that were incomprehensible to outsiders. Part of it was motivation. These men weren't fighting for abstract geopolitical goals. They were fighting for Norway, for their families, for their homes that had been occupied and oppressed. That kind of motivation doesn't break easily. But part of it was also something harder to quantify, something you might call judgment, or adaptability, or simply the ability to keep thinking clearly when everything is falling apart. When the plan didn't work, they improvised. When the terrain was worse than expected, they found another way. When the odds seemed impossible, they took one more step. In the years after the war, most of the Gunnerside team returned to Norway and lived quiet lives. Joachim Rønneberg became a radio engineer and later a broadcaster, rarely speaking about the operation. Knut Haukelid wrote a memoir and spent time reflecting on the moral weight of sabotage and resistance. Others disappeared into anonymity, uncomfortable with the hero worship that occasionally came their way. They didn't see themselves as heroes. They saw themselves as men who did what was necessary. In interviews late in their lives, Several of them said variations of the same thing. We were just doing our job. Anyone would have done the same. But that's not true, and they knew it. Not everyone would have. Not everyone could have. Most people, faced with a mission that dangerous, that cold, that likely to end in death or capture, would have found reasons to hesitate, to delay, to reconsider. These 9 men didn't. They jumped out of a plane into a frozen wilderness, climbed down a cliff in the dark, broke into a heavily guarded Nazi facility, planted explosives with frozen fingers, and then skied across one of the harshest landscapes on Earth to escape. And they did it, knowing that their success might never be known, that they might die unremarked and unremembered, that the world might never understand what they'd prevented. Operation Gunnerside is not a household name. It doesn't have the cultural weight of D-Day, or the Battle of Stalingrad, or the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Most history textbooks mention it in a paragraph, if at all. Films have been made about it, some good, some terrible, but they haven't captured the public imagination the way other wartime stories have. Why? Maybe because it's a story about something that didn't happen. The German atomic bomb that was never built, the cities that were never destroyed, the apocalypse that was averted. It's hard to make a monument to a catastrophe that didn't occur, but that's exactly why this story matters. Because so much of history is about what did happen, the battles fought, the cities burned, the empires that rose and fell. We spend less time thinking about the catastrophes that were prevented, the disasters that were averted, the terrible futures that never came to pass because someone, somewhere, made a choice and took a risk. Operation Gunnerside is a reminder that sometimes the most important victories are the ones that prevent the worst outcomes. That sometimes courage isn't about charging into battle, but about climbing down a frozen cliff in the dark because no one else will. That sometimes the fate of millions rests on the judgment and nerve of a handful of people who refuse to give up, even when every rational calculation says they should. In 1995, Joachim Rønneberg was asked in an interview if he was proud of what they'd accomplished. He paused, choosing his words carefully, the way he'd once chosen each foothold on that icy descent. Proud is the wrong word, he said. Relieved, grateful. We did what we set out to do, and we all survived. That's more than most people get. He died in 2018, at the age of 99, one of the last surviving members of the team. When the news of his death reached Norway, tributes poured in from across the world. Leaders called him a hero. Historians called the operation one of the most successful special forces missions in history. But the description that would have meant the most to him came from an old resistance fighter who simply said he was a good Norwegian. On a frozen mountainside in Vemork, there's a small monument to Operation Gunnerside now. It's not grand or imposing, just a simple stone marker that lists the names of the men who carried out the mission and a brief description of what they did. Tourists occasionally visit, taking photos, reading the plaque, trying to imagine what it must have been like. But no photograph, no plaque, no documentary can truly capture what those 9 men experienced in February 1943. The cold that burned their lungs, the fear that shadowed every step, the weight of knowing that millions of lives might depend on whether they could plant explosives in the right place and get out alive. All we can do is remember. And in remembering, ask ourselves, if we were given a mission that seemed impossible, a task that terrified us, a choice between safety and necessity, what would we do? Would we hesitate? Would we find reasons to say no? Or would we lace up our boots, check our gear, and step into the darkness, trusting that courage and planning and a little bit of luck might be enough? The men of Operation Gunnerside didn't know they'd succeed. They just knew they had to try. And sometimes, in the cold arithmetic of history, trying is enough. Sometimes, 9 men on skis can change the world.